I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth, in cages, closets, cellars, and pens, chained naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. Dorothea Dix, 1843.
In 1841, Quaker Dorothea Dix was invited to teach Sunday school at the East Cambridge House of Correction. There she found a group of mentally ill women living in a dank, smelly, unheated, and poorly ventilated room. Over the next 3 years, Dix visited more than 800 prisons, poorhouses, and insane asylums in Massachusetts, which she found equally offensive and degrading. Around the country, other men and women began uncovering the sorry state of institutions for the poor, sick, and needy in America. In the 1840s and 50s, reformers revamped and reorganized institutions across the country. The Orphan Society of Philadelphia asked for funds to provide a place where children are sheltered from the perils of want and the contamination of evil example. Caretakers introduced systems of work, learning, and religious instruction.
I was informed that it was beautiful to see them pray, for at the first tip of the whistle, they all dropped on their knees. Lydia Child.
American prisons in Auburn, New York, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, drew worldwide attention by combining religious instruction with architectural innovations. Keeping its prisoners in solitary confinement, Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary became a major tourist attraction for Europeans who were both fascinated and appalled by its architecture and philosophy of reform. In orphanages, hospitals, and prisons around the country, sanitation improved, educational opportunities increased, and healthy exercise replaced tiny cells. Along with better conditions came strict discipline, regimented days, and religious instruction designed to convert the soul and bring cheerful submission. It seemed that changing the environment really could change people. And if it worked for the poor and needy, why not for others?
We are all a little wild here with numberless projects of social reform. Not a reading man has but a draft of a new community in his waistcoat pocket. Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Another part of this fascinating period of reform was an impulse to form utopian communities where people would live communally. They would share everything together, but they would live apart from the rest of society and try and perfect themselves.
Many hoped to build a perfect society, a utopia. The times were right. Industry was booming, land was cheap and easy to get, and the government allowed many freedoms.
Sometimes these were religious societies, sometimes they were secular. The main thing they offered was a refuge from the outside world, from the hustle and bustle of the American city, from the hustle and bustle of factory work, and from the hustle and bustle of increasing commercialism.
Scottish businessman Robert Owen came to America in 1824 to set up New Harmony, a socialist utopia in Indiana.
Several hundreds of families sharing everything together and living, men and women separately, celibately, built quite a thriving town. But it didn't last very long. These utopias had a way of burning themselves out.
More successful were the Shakers, who built communities first in New Lebanon, New York, and then throughout the East and Midwest. The Shaker group stayed small mainly because of their strict requirements: no sex, no marriage, no money, and no private property. Hard work, they believed, was a key to perfection.
Up at 4:30 a.m. Work and worship filled nearly every minute. You must not lose one moment of time, for you have none to spare. The devil tempts others, but an idle person tempts the devil. Mother Ann Lee.
In New England, the Transcendentalists emphasized the individual over organized religion or the state. They wanted to transcend, to go above the ordinary, to perfect themselves and society. Henry David Thoreau withdrew from family and friends and built a small cabin near Walden Pond. He believed that bustling cities took people away from nature and that government interfered with freedom.
There will never be a really free and enlightened state until the state comes to recognize the individual as a higher and independent power. Henry David Thoreau.
By the late 1840s, Thoreau put forth his concept of civil disobedience, the individual's right to disobey unjust laws. It was a concept shared by many. Some transcendentalists actively helped slaves escape, arguing that slavery was against God's law and crushed the human spirit. More and more Americans were disgusted with slavery. But how could they fight the powerful southern states that depended on slave labor to keep their economy growing?
The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it. Thomas Jefferson, 1835.
Letters and diaries from the late 1700s and early 1800s contained guilt-ridden passages about slavery.
Of all the reform movements in the first half of the 19th century, the most important and the most divisive was anti-slavery, abolitionism, the move to eradicate slavery from American life.
But masters desiring to free their slaves faced a real problem, for few white Americans believed that the races could live together. What then should be the fate of freed slaves?
In the 1820s, the American Colonization Society took the position, had long taken the position, that the solution to the so-called race problem of the day was to collect African Americans together and ship them back to their homeland in Africa.
They bought a tract of land, now called Liberia, and named its capital Monrovia, after President Monroe. Fewer than 15,000 African Americans actually went to Liberia. Others went to Haiti. But colonization was clearly not the answer. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison began publishing The Liberator, which called for an immediate end to slavery. Uncompromising in his opposition to slavery, Garrison once burned the Constitution.
William Lloyd Garrison, a Boston abolitionist, called the Constitution a covenant with death, an agreement with hell. That tells you something about the strong language that he would describe the Constitution, which protected slavery, in those terms. So it was very divisive, but of course it was very important, because until slavery was eradicated, there would never be peace in America.
Being anti-slavery didn't necessarily mean being anti-racist. Some abolitionists spoke about African Americans as children who needed protection. They would allow civil and religious freedoms, but not social equality, and especially not interracial marriages. Men and women who had lived in slavery, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, proved to be some of the most effective abolitionists.
The most telling, the most killing refutation of slavery is the presentation of an industrious, enterprising, thrifty, and intelligent black population. Frederick Douglass, 1853.
Women found themselves in the public eye for their efforts. Under a law designed to keep slaves from learning how to read the anti-slavery pamphlets sent south by Northern abolitionists, women were fired and jailed for teaching African American children to read in Virginia. Harriet Tubman carried a $40,000 bounty on her head for leading slaves north to freedom through the Underground Railroad.
Harriet Tubman had been born into slavery. She was married to a man who was not a slave. She wanted to leave the territory. She wanted her own freedom. And she couldn't convince him to go with her. And she went anyway. And she wound up crossing the state line by herself, having left him behind, completely on her own. At the same time, feeling that she had been, in a sense, reborn by now being a free person and being determined to do what she could to free first her family and then whoever else she could bring out. And she went back to the South over and over again, putting herself in danger of being recaptured.
Our mails were clogged with abolition pamphlets and inflammatory documents to be distributed among our southern Negroes to induce them to cut our throats. J. Baker, 1853.
People, reformers, were interested in women's rights. They were interested in temperance, movement to abolish alcohol, etc., etc. Increasingly, these people became preoccupied with one issue, and that was slavery.
In so many areas, Americans, men and women, blacks and whites, appeared to be moving toward the ideals the nation was founded on: the essential dignity and equality of all human beings, and the inalienable rights to freedom, justice, and opportunity. The flurry of reform activity changed life for many Americans, but heaven never came to earth. The struggle over slavery would split the nation in two and bring America to war.